So I'm back, Book of Ruth. By the way, I know I've been gone a couple weeks. Well, Ken, I won't be here next week. Sorry, that's week 7. I got to do a research paper. But after that, all right. So Book Ruth. We left off with Judges, just a horrible train wreck of a book. God is nowhere to be found. We're in the sin spin cycle. How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? It's a sin spin cycle. We can all say that 5 times fast. All right, so if you remember, I said the book of Judges leaves you wondering where's God as Israel continues down this sin spin cycle. Ruth takes place about the same time of Judges. When? We actually don't know. And the reason for this is we don't know the author. There's no way of telling from the internal evidence, from inside the way Ruth is written. The ending of Ruth is a complete genealogy that lists King David. So we know that Ruth was at least edited later on after King David was at least born. So this kind of gives somewhat of a later dating after Judges, which makes when Ruth happened a little bit difficult. I would say definitely before Samson, that during the period of Judges. So that's kind of the setting of Ruth. But if you remember, I also told you that Ruth is the glimmer of hope. When all seems lost for Israel, somewhere behind the scenes, God is pulling the strings. He's working out a plan. And so everybody calls Ruth the Book of Hope. Now, I've also told you it should be named the Book of Naomi, and we're going to go through why. Now, some fun facts about this book. The narrator never mentions God doing anything directly in the story. God's almost absent from this story when you read all 4 chapters. It's a very long book. I mean, it'll take you all of 15 minutes to read. But you'll notice you don't hear the Lord saying, "Thus say the Lord," or "the Lord split the water." He's really not there. You might hear Ruth say, "Your God will be my God." He's kind of distant, right? Almost kind of sounds like today. There's a reason for this. The way the narrator is setting this up is it's kind of about the interplay of God's purpose and humans' decisions and being faithful, right? And, sorry. And James kind of makes a case about this. Consider it pure joy, brothers and sisters, when you face trials of all kinds. His point is, don't be smile when bad stuff comes your way, but if we go through trials God's ways, we're going to see what God knew about us, right? We're going to have to make the right choice and go through the trial the way God wanted us, and we will know what God knew about us. Or we can choose to go through the trial the world's way, and we're not going to have God's knowledge about us. Hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of a very tough concept, I know. In Ruth, we're going to get the same interplay. People are going to have choices. And if they make the right choice, if they're faithful to God, good things are going to happen. And that's exactly what happens, and that's why God is so far absent. His purpose will be met. And that's ultimately going to be King David, who's going to be the ancestor of Jesus, who's going to die for sin. So God's purpose will be fulfilled, but there's this interplay with human choice and faithfulness. And that's what the narrator wants people to understand, and that's why God is kind of drawn back in the story. Now, Naomi thinks she's being punished by the death of all the men in her life, and we're going to get to that. It's in chapter 1. But the story is about God using Ruth to restore Naomi and her family. Ruth, who by her loyalty is going to bring Boaz with his generosity and gentleness into Naomi's life and fulfill more than she could have ever hoped. Another fun fact, this is one of 7 books in the Old Testament without any poetry. Makes it very interesting when you hear people argue, how should we understand Ruth? There's no poetry. Some people think it should be very literal. Kind of an interesting argument, but we're also going to see there's a lot of fun wordplay in Ruth. Such as, the story begins with Elimelech leaving his hometown of Bethlehem Lechem, and see, you guys thought I only spoke Greek, meaning house of bread. And this is because of a famine. You guys get the joke? He left the house of bread because of a famine. So if you actually read this in Hebrew, you start to see the word plays. And so there is no poetry, but this is very purposeful. Some people even argue that Ruth is supposed to be somewhat of a comedy. I'm being very serious about this. Now, Naomi is going to later return to the city because, in verse 1:6, the Lord had considered his people and he gave them bread. Yet another joke. They left because of a famine, they get bread. Okay. The word here again is lechem. And I'm sorry, I can't do the K's right now. So, the author begins the story of the house of bread, which has no bread, and the characters return to the house of bread when the Lord gives them bread, just in time for the barley harvest. The wordplay, and then there's also wordplay with the names of many of the characters that alerts the audience to their role in the story. For example, the two sons, Mahlon and Chilon, means sickness and extermination. Guess how they die? Yeah. So, kind of in the Old Testament, you really have to be careful naming your kids because, man, their names seem to come true. Like, now I forget his name. When he dies, it will come. Methuselah, right? No. What? Yeah, the oldest guy in the Bible. Yeah, Methuselah. When he dies, it will come. He died, the flood came. His parents must have kept him alive forever. Like, I mean, you got to be careful with names in the Old Testament. Hey, come here, sickness. I mean, how horrible. He must have been bullied a lot. Repetition. Okay, that's another thing to pay attention to in the book of Ruth. For example, the author repeatedly emphasized Moab. And Moab, we should know a lot if we paid attention to the Torah about Moab. Anybody remember where Moab started? Lot. Yeah. There's some female intertwinings involved with Lot, too. Kind of gross ones, too. Which is meant to draw a parallel with Ruth, right? The righteousness of women starts off really bad, then you get to Ruth, she's actually really good. And it goes through Rahab and some other stuff. The author's very intentional about that. But he's going to use the title Ruth the Moabite 5 times. He refers to her as the foreigner multiple times, the Moabite wife many times. He's really emphasizing that she's a Moabite. And this is important when you know the law. The Bible first introduces Moab as the son of an incestuous union between Lot and his daughter in Genesis 19. And because of that, Deuteronomy 23:3 declares that no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of their descendants shall be admitted to the Lord. Now, this might create an issue, because if Ruth is a Moabite and none of her descendants can be admitted into the assembly of the Lord, can King David be a king? Oh, that's the rub, right? So, that's the law. Deuteronomy is very clear about Moabites. But here, and we have Ruth, who is a Moabite. And this book is going to answer why King David isn't a Moabite. He's actually from the line of Judah. But anyhow, Moabites aren't allowed in for 2 reasons. They did not provide the Israelites with food and water when they were coming out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam to curse the Israelites in Numbers 22 through 24, which we talked about when I taught the class on Numbers. Remember, talking donkey? Right? Okay. So what else is wrong with the Moabites? In Judges, we talked about a couple weeks ago, the Lord strengthens the king of Moab against Israel, who served Moab for 18 years. That's in Judges 3. We didn't go into detail about that. A Moabite wife is listed among the foreign wives of Solomon. So we haven't gotten there yet, but God knew that would happen. Solomon himself is going to build a high place for a Moabite god, Chemosh, in 1 Kings. And in the post-exile literature of Ezra, Nehemiah, The Moabites are one of the foreign groups mentioned that must be expelled from the midst of the people, and that's in Nehemiah. So we're going to get there. Basically, God knows the Moabites are bad for Israel, right? So in Deuteronomy, when he gave the law, he said, don't mix with the Moabites. So references such as these demonstrate that the Moabites are not highly regarded in many biblical texts. The author demonstrates familiar, so whoever wrote Ruth definitely knew the Israelite legal traditions, no doubt about that. For example, Ruth is allowed to gather in the Israelites' field during the grain harvest. This is a right reserved for poor and foreigners, of which Ruth is both. This is like found in Leviticus 19, 23, Deuteronomy 24. And we're going to see that Naomi knows the obligation of what's called a kinsman redeemer. And I'm going to go into details about that too, which is in Leviticus 25. And so like in Leviticus 19, verses 9 through 10, it says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap the field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip the vineyard bare, neither shall you glean the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor or the poor sojourner, for I am the Lord. So that's a law right out of Leviticus. When you read Ruth, you're going to see that Boaz left the size of his field for all the foreigners to pick up. He's a very righteous man following the law. This book demonstrates that whoever wrote it was definitely very familiar with the law. Is basically kind of the point. Let's see. Now, as far as the kinsman redeemer in Leviticus 25:25, and I'm going to explain the redeemer portion of the law. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. Leviticus 25:25. Okay, so that's a portion of it, and we're going to get into the Yabrum, which is the Levirate marriage. That's another fun Hebrew word. So hopefully I'm not going too fast. Just giving you some facts as we start to open up Ruth. Okay? So, as we get into Ruth, it's divided into 4 parts. Each part corresponds to each of the 4 chapters. If you remember, I've told you guys about that thing called a chiasm, where it's like A, B, B, A to kind of outline the structure of the passage. So like with the flood, you have 40 days of rain, 40 days of drying, 120 days, right? And then God remembers Noah in the middle. So that's kind of a chiasm. That's how Ruth is. But the way it starts off is in chapter 1 is tragedy and death. That's our A, tragedy and death. So we've got famine that drives Elimelech and his family into Moab, and then everybody dies except for Naomi. And then she's going to head home, and she has 2 daughter-in-laws. One decides to stay, and one decides to go with her. Now, if you ask a lot of people, they'll say the greatest day in the history of man is when Neil Armstrong stepped out of the Apollo and said, I take one small step for man, one. I disagree. I say it's the day that they found an empty tomb. Now, would that mean the Apollo is the second greatest day in mankind? I disagree. We're about ready to see the second greatest day. That's the day that Ruth said, I'm going to go with you and your God will be my God. Because had she not chosen that day to go with Naomi, well, maybe somebody else would have redeemed the land and God would have found a way for Jesus to be born. But it was her choice to go with Naomi that day that would have led to the generations of Jesus. And that's kind of what the author's getting at, is God has a purpose and there's human interplay. And we're never going to understand how those two work together, but they do. And God's in charge of that, but they're going to work together. And that's what makes that probably the second greatest day in all of history. So, Ruth 1:2 describes Elimelech's family as Ephraimites, and this is important, from Bethlehem in Judah. While the designation Ephraimites varies in the Bible, the term has connections to David, who is described in 1 Samuel 17:12 as the son of Ephraimite of Bethlehem in Judah. So, Elimelech is Naomi's husband. David is described as the son of Elimelech. All right? He's not described as the son of Obed or the grandson of Obed or of Boaz or of Ruth. This is very important about the kinsman redeemer. And we're going to see this in chapter 4 of Ruth. Obed is Naomi's son, even though Ruth gave birth to him. That's what we have to understand. That's how we get around the law. When Naomi's husband dies, he has an inheritance that has to go somewhere. But his two sons, sickness and extermination, they died of sickness and extermination. His inheritance can't go anywhere. So by the law, a kinsman has to marry his wife, Naomi. But she's going to change her name to Bitterness. She's too old to marry and have kids. She even has this conversation with Ruth. I'm too old. What are you going to do, marry the baby in my womb? It's kind of funny, actually, the way she says it. I'm too old. You can't marry the baby in my womb. So Naomi can't have kids is what she's saying. But Ruth attaches herself because she was married to her son, saying, like, okay, like, I can marry in your place. So this is part of the law. So if she can marry somebody from Elimelech's line, that man would inherit all of Elimelech's property and titles. Whoever the firstborn son is will carry the name of Elimelech, the line of Judah. That's very important because the scepter will not depart the tribe of Judah, a prophecy given for the Messiah. I know it sounds very weird, but this is all part of the law. And it gets into throwing sandals at people. Trust me, it's kind of fun. They still do it today in Jewish courts. They'll spit at each other and hit them with a sandal. I promise you, it's actually still done today. I know, some very strange stuff. It takes a long time of reading. And this is what's called the Yibrum. It's called a Levirate marriage, the fact of marrying your brother's dead wife. Remember the Sadducees asked Jesus, hey, a brother dies and a man marries his wife. Do you guys remember that? They're talking about the Levirate marriage because, let's say I go out and get married and I'm an Orthodox Jew and I have no kids. My brother is required to marry my wife, because I'm the oldest, to have a kid that's going to carry my name and my traditions and take my inheritance. That's not his kid, that's my kid. Genetically, sure, it's kind of his, but he's having it in my place. That's what the Levirate marriage is. Now, his next kid would be his oldest firstborn. That's how the Jews do this out of Leviticus. So, in the Jewish wedding, when somebody says, does anybody see a reason for this man and woman not to be wed? The second oldest brother has a real good reason to say, I object, if he doesn't like the bride. Just saying. Bad joke. But Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, this is where they get it from. This is the Yibrum, the Levirate marriage. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go to her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of the husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the dead brother, that is, his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then the brother's wife shall go up to the gate of elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetrate his brother's name in Israel, and he will not perform the duty of his husband's brothers to me. That's actually important in the book of Ruth. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him, and if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull off his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face. I wasn't kidding about that part. And she shall say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. This is actually going to play out in the book of Israel, or in the book of Ruth. So, Elimelech, Malian, Chilion, they die, leaving no heir to Elimelech's land in Judah. Naomi decides to go back to Israel and change her name to Bitter. Now, and so we see that in Ruth verse 8 through 14. Now we get into chapter 2. This is the start of the barley harvest. We're going to find out Boaz is a man of noble character. He actually really is a good man. People today say there's no good men left. Probably not. They stopped with Boaz. And what we see in verse 2:11, and this is where we see that Boaz is a man of noble character. But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and your mother of your native land and come to the people that you did not know before. He's basically kind of summing up that he's heard of Ruth, he's going to take care of her, he's leaving the land for her. This one verse kind of sums up his character and how he sees her as a good, righteous woman, and that speaks volumes to his character as well. He follows the law in Deuteronomy 24:19 that says when you reap the harvest of your field and forget a sheaf in the field, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the fatherless, the widows. He does that on purpose. In fact, he even tells his people, leave extra, right? Like he's that good of a person. And Naomi then tells Ruth that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, or is kin to them and a possible redeemer. Right? So that means that if Boaz marries Naomi, but she can't have kids, so he could marry the widow of her son and redeem all of Elimelech's land, right? So we know what, and so before I get to chapter 3, kind of in the chiastic structure, we started off with death and tragedy. Now we have like Naomi and Ruth planning. So it looks at Naomi and Ruth, and then the climax is going to be Ruth and Boaz really talking again to know each other. And then as we go into verse 3, it's going to be, still Ruth and Boaz together, and it's going to start to descend with Ruth and Naomi kind of waiting on Boaz. So that's kind of how the structure of this chapter or this book's going. But as we get into verse 3, we see the women scheme, because women never do that. They never plan to get a man, right? They do. Spoiler alert. So the women scheme. Hey, Boaz was a good man. The Bible said so. But the women scheme, and we get this from Ruth 3:3. What she says is, wash therefore and anoint yourself, put your cloak down and go to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. What this verse says is, stop dressing like a widow. Let Boaz know you're on the market. That's what she's telling her in this verse, right? Because up until then, she would have been dressed as if she's in mourning. And Naomi's like, girl, you're done. Get dressed. Yeah, let the man know that you're single, right? Like you two like each other. Everybody knows but you two. So that's what happens. Now here's kind of a cool thing. In Ruth 3:11, Boaz tells Ruth that he knows that she's a noble woman. And the word he used is Eseth Halel. Or not Halel, sorry. Hayel. Yeah, Hayel. Eseth Hayel. Noble woman. This is, when you read Proverbs 31 about a righteous woman, a noble woman, there's an acrostic structure from verses 10 through 31 in Hebrew. The acrostic structure is Eseth Yahel, noble woman. Same word that Boaz calls Ruth. It's very intentional. This isn't an accident at all, especially given that Ruth was probably written sometime around King David, King Solomon, and King Solomon wrote most of the Proverbs. This is not an accident that Ruth is known as a noble woman. Nobody thinks so. So she is definitely, like I said, when the Bible, and I'm not going to go down that road of where the Bible starts with like Lot's wives, goes through, there's another one, I forget which one, and then Rahab, and then Ruth, where it's just showing the generations of Gentile women getting better and better. And it's doing this as a type. In fact, actually, I think it ultimately leads to Mary, and it's not a Catholic thing, but it's doing this on purpose, and it's like a typology of righteousness. But they're still sinful people. They're not perfect, so let's not confuse that. But then we get to chapter 4, and this is kind of the big conclusion. And what we find out is there is another relative who's closer than Boaz, so he can be the redeemer, right? And turns out that Naomi's husband had quite a bit of land. It's a good deal. So this redeemer's like, oh yeah, I'll take that money. And Boaz, he's a pretty smart guy, as it turns out. He's noble, but he's nobody's fool. So he's like, yeah. Hey man, you're the closer kinsman, so you're going to get, all of Elimelech's and sickness and extermination's land. Oh, but there's one little catch. You're going to have to marry a Moabite. The Moabites. Ooh. And so this kinsman redeemer's like, oh, I forgot. I got a doctor's appointment that day. Here, take my sandal. And they actually describe the sandal situation in Ruth. That's why I brought up that verse out of Deuteronomy. The author is very specifically drawn us to the Yabrom, that Levirate marriage, about the sandal and the kinsman redeemer. This is a very important draw. But that closer brother, the refusing to marry the Moabite because she's a Moabite, he backs out. Now, why does Boaz go, oh, she's a Moabite? Because Boaz has met her. He knows that she's a noble woman. That's why I just brought that up. He knows that she's actually a really good person. He knows he's getting the best deal ever. Not only is he getting a lot of land, but he's getting the girl. Yeah, she's not a bad Moabite. He's getting a very noble woman. He probably would have done it without the land. The land is just the bonus. That's the cherry on the cake. So Boaz pulled the ultimate deal on his own kin here. And so they go through the Yabrom, and Boaz says, I'll take the land, and I guess if I have to marry the Moabite, I guess I will. I guess I'll marry. And there's even this funny verse where, he talks about her being a young woman and she had the choice to go off with any guy. And he's like, I guess I'll marry the young pretty girl. Dang. Like I said, Ruth does have some comedy to it. And then we get to this conclusion. And this is what a lot of people miss. So I always say this is the book of Naomi. Remember, in chapter 1, it starts off talking about Naomi leaving the land with her husband, which is very weird because normally you would talk about the husband leaving with his wife. And then we get to the end, and in Ruth chapter 4, verse 17, it says, and the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, they're talking about Ruth's baby, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. Oh, look at that. Ruth gave birth, but all the women say, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So, this kinsman redemption, remember when I read the Deuteronomical law, I said that the first son would carry on the name of the dead. That's exactly what's going on here. Because Naomi's husband, Elimelech, right? Now I already forgot his name, sorry. Elimelech is dead. Naomi has a son. She's no longer bitter, by the way. But yeah, so when everybody's like, oh, well, a Moabite can't be in the assembly of the Lord till the 10th generation. Obed wasn't a Moabite. He was born by a Moabite, but his mother was Naomi. And that's why when we went back to 1 Samuel, and that's why I bring this up, Ruth 1:2 describes Elimelech's family as Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah. And in 1 Samuel, it says very much, now David was the son of an Ephraimite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who's had 8 sons in the days of Saul, the man who is already old and advanced in years. So 1 Samuel also ties David to an Ephraimite, which in Ruth, the Ephraimite is Elimelech, not Boaz. So genealogically, according to Israelite law, Obed goes to Elimelech, not to Boaz. DNA-wise, yeah, Obed was born from Boaz and Ruth. But to avoid the Moabite prohibition of the law, Boaz, by doing what he did, his firstborn was redeemed to Naomi. So a lot of people do confuse, going, well, a Moabite can't be to the 10th generation in the assembly of the Lord. And this has caused a lot of people confusion. They say the Bible contradicts itself. Jesus couldn't be the Messiah because Ruth was a Moabite. No. The law is very clear if you understand the law, and which, obviously, the Bible supports itself, and there is no contradictions. And now, to finish our chiasm, like I said, the first chapter was tragedy and death, right? Then, of course, we have Naomi and Ruth planning, Ruth and Boaz together, and then we have Naomi and Ruth waiting. And then, so in the fourth chapter, if the first chapter was tragedy and death, joy and birth. And that finishes the book of Ruth. Now, what's the point of Ruth, right? Like we talked about, God is kind of absent from this book, which is an interesting book to put in the Bible, to kind of have God absent. The author does this so that after you read this book, you walk away asking yourself one big question. Because, again, it's going to take you a whole 15, 20 minutes to read this book. It's a long investment of your time. The book invites us to ponder how God works in the mundane details of our lives. That's the whole point of this book. Naomi, oh, my family's died. I'm just going to wander home to the house of bread. Oh, this weirdo's following me. Okay, I'm going to go pick some harvest. Oh, these two are talking. Just mundane things. Where's God in all of this? And all of a sudden, everything's redeemed, and, oh, by the way, Jesus is going to be born. I mean, right? Like, he's not mentioned at all. But in the background, unseen to everybody, God is weaving a tapestry of such beauty. And that's what the author wants us to see, is even when we don't see God in the most mundane aspects of our lives, he is doing something brilliant and wonderful. So that's the book of hope. That's the book of Naomi, also known as the book of Ruth.
So Naomi actually raised the son.
Yeah, there's another verse in there that says that she was given to be his nurse.